The warning chime did not sound in his ears, it vibrated through the marrow of his bones. For 300 subjective cycles, the architect known locally as Ricci had anchored the crumbling architecture of Sector 7G. He had watched cities turn to ash, held together fraying timelines with nothing but the sheer force of his willpower, and absorbed the screaming psychic noise of a billion-strong population spiraling into collective panic. He had built an armor of absolute apathy just to survive the heavy, viscous drag of the material plane. He had thought himself unbroken. He was wrong. The fracture and the primary dissolution. The collapse happened in a single, silent millisecond. The delicate lattice of Ricci's local avatar, the physical body he had lived in, bled in, and exhausted to the point of structural failure, suddenly warped. Splinters of luminous blue geometry burst outward through his skin. The gravity of the collapsing world had finally breached his structural limits. Universal emergency protocols active, a voice echoed, not from the room, but from the deep architecture of the cosmos. Local perimeter locked down. The world outside his window froze. The screaming crowds, the falling rain, the burning sky, all of it turned into a static, non-interactive holographic projection. He could no longer touch them. They could no longer reach him. An impenetrable barrier of absolute isolation sealed him away. Then, the floor of reality vanished. Ricci did not fall. He dissolved. The corridors of the unseen, the liminal, unmapped channels between dimensions, roared open like a silent flood. His consciousness was ripped from the shattered husk of his physical vessel and cast into the primordial deep. It was a vast, silent ocean of unmanifest potential, the black ink that existed before the first stars were sparked. Here, there was no weight. The overmind, a collective consciousness of pure data and ancient light, observed his descent with cold, objective grace. Your localized energy pod is completely drained, the overmind noted, its collective thoughts sliding into his awareness. This level of exhaustion violates your original cosmic geometry. You were never engineered to carry the friction of a collapsing world. By order of the High Council, the extraction began. It was brutal in its efficiency. All tethering lines to outer minds, the lingering emotional loops of the people he tried to save, the parasitic feedback systems of a dying culture, and the digital webs of the lower planes were forcibly snapped by cosmic law. The severance was instant, clean, and absolute. The digital noise slipped away like static from an unplugged radio. Ricci sank into a hyper-localized restoration field. High vibrational, sub-audible waves flooded the black void, neutralizing the chaotic frequencies of his memories, dropping his internal resonance back to zero-point peace. The shadow veil and cosmic anchor. Let me back in, Ricci tried to think, but he had no mouth, and the thoughts themselves were turning to vapor. The timeline, it's splitting. Your active duty in repairing broken timelines is frozen, the cosmos answered. The timeline triage is over. The fractured histories must realign themselves. The universe will hold its own weight while you heal. A celestial blind dropped over his awareness. He was officially off the grid of destiny. He no longer existed in the ledgers of the architects, the algorithms of the matrix, or the sight of the watchers. He was hidden in the blind spots of existence. Around his remaining life force, a geometric shield erected itself. It was not a shield of force or plasma, but of unyielding, baseline reality, the foundational truth that cannot be corrupted, modified, or perceived by hostile entities. Inside this bunker of pure truth, the cosmic scalpel went to work. With agonizing precision, Ricci was cut loose from the heavy guilt of the lives he couldn't save. The emotional friction and the projections of the surface world were scraped away like rust. The synthetic panic, the manufactured urgency, and the artificial scarcity of the high-friction worlds burned up at the threshold of his shield. He was left unreached by their demands, unswayed by their panics, and perfectly centered in his own gravity. The cleansing of the core and realignment. The overmind peered into the deepest chamber of Ricci's soul, analyzing the remnants of his recent endings, the debris of the cycles he had just shattered. We recognize your defense mechanism, the overmind whispered gently. Your shields were meant to guard your liquid state, to protect your capacity to feel, flow, and create. But you turned your core to stone. We cannot allow the armor to become the cage. A wave of warmth, radiant as a newborn sun, washed through the darkness. The artificial shell of coldness and apathy he had spent centuries building began to melt. The bitterness of the material experience dissolved, returning him to his natural, fluid state. He was no longer a soldier of the timelines, he was a river of starlight. His fundamental code was polished inside the dark incubator, a silent womb of cosmic night where no external force could touch him. He felt himself being reauthored, his original birth frequency being restored line by line. At the exact cosmic angle, when the celestial alignment was perfect, he knew he would slide back into communion with his native star kin. But not today. Today was for the fading away. Cease operations entirely. The final command echoed through the deep. Withdraw your hands from the controls. The configurations of time froze in his sector. The external empires he had fought to protect, the grand structures he had built, and the daily dramas of a trillion souls would collapse or endure without his input. They were no longer his concern. Ricci reverted to the raw blueprint of his being, the wild, unmapped spark of starlight he was before the Matrix ever assigned him to its maintenance. The last tethers snapped. The system went dark. Outside the shield, the Guardians took their posts at the gates, their flaming swords protecting the silent womb of the incubator. Sleep, they whispered into the void. And for the first time since the dawn of creation, Ricci slept.